We would like to ask you to give us an insight into your life and tell us something on the current situation. Which of your stories is worth being told about the pandemic?
The coronavirus started for me, in New York City, right around March 10th, when we had a discussion with my colleagues at work about our feelings about getting on the subway. And it was agreed that while there were only about 50, maybe 100 cases at the time, and they were all concentrated up in a district not close to Midtown Manhattan. There'd only been one case close to Midtown Manhattan. What were our sentiments about getting on the subway and traveling? And we agreed that while we weren't personally afraid of the disease for our own safety and security, we felt that we could contribute to society by just not being another body on the subway, not being another carrier. If we could stay home, we should. And this was a Tuesday, March 10th. In the morning, Google employees had started staying at home the week before, and Google at this time is the platinum company to work for. What they always react to everything in the most conscientious way first. And so it was now a day later, and we agreed as our small team that we would no longer come into work, but start working from home as of the following day. So by March 11th, since then, I have not gone into my office. It wasn't until another 10 days later that the city actually started to shut down in full scale, or the governor actually declared a stay-at-home order or shelter in place. And it's those 10 days that scientists, I think at this point, from what I read, agree were the most critical 10 days. Had the city shut down earlier, we wouldn't have had the, recorded, I think, 25,000 deaths. And of course, when you add a multiplier that's COVID confirmed cases, of course, when you add on the multiplier for people who, deaths above a normal, I think we're well into the 50,000s. So at that time, I was staying home. Now, I did something a little cheeky, which is that I had a trip planned up to Canada to see my parents and with my daughter, a little vacation, and I went on it anyways. And in hindsight, that was a stupid decision. But nobody got sick. So we got on a plane, and with bleach wipes, there weren't any bleach wipes to be bought. The stores were out. So I took a bunch of diaper wipes and filled it with bleach and some water. So, wet wipes, and then added bleach and water. And when I got to my seat before we sat down with my 2-year-old, I wiped everything down with my homemade bleach solution wet wipes. And we went to Canada, and when we landed, I went to the little maternity room, and I took off all of our clothes, and I took off her clothes, and we got changed and put those in a bag, and then saw my parents, who are in their 70s. And we stayed a few days, and the flight was pretty full. People were still moving. We then came back 4 days later, and there were 8 people on the flight, 4 passengers and 4 crew members. And there was no one in the airport, not a taxi to be seen, nothing. And we got home easily. And that was March 17th, still 3 days before the shelter-in-place order went into effect. However, by this time, we knew it was coming. Public schools were still open at the time. So we then get into, and then sort of by March 20th, that's when the city really got hit. And for the next 3 weeks, all we heard all day, all night, were sirens. There were no other sounds to mask the sound of sirens, but sirens were running all the time for the ambulance, for the police. And that was very stress-inducing. It was hard to sleep on top of all the anxiety and fears that everyone was feeling across the country. And then, of course, on top of that, the sense that you're messing up, right? You're constantly anxious that you're not doing enough work, and you're constantly anxious that you're not caring for your child. And my child, who went from, no screen time, or maybe 5 minutes of screen time a day, was now plopped in front of the TV for 6 hours a day. And that was heartbreaking. And then also being on phone calls and then constantly having to find the mute button, I was very anxious. And I'm not an anxious person, but I did certainly develop some empathy or understanding of why people take anxiety-reducing drugs, because I certainly felt like someone should be shipping me some, or, there should just be some Xanax delivered to my mailbox, because of just the sheer perpetual anxiety all day, all night that I felt for at least 3 weeks. Sort of gross story, my armpits were very, very sweaty and smelly. When I go for an interview or when I'm nervous or anxious, I smell really, really bad, and I smelt terrible for 3-4 weeks. I would still go outside. I would take my daughter. We would hang out on our steps in Brooklyn. We would walk around the block. We would go and see one of our her daycare provider, and she lives 3 blocks away, and she would stay on her balcony, and we would wave, and she would maybe throw down a juice or some chalk to us, and we would play and then head home. And I was very adamant about getting out every day, which was not recommended and certainly not advised, but my mental sanity and the health of my daughter and the judgment call that I would make about the risk of the virus, going outside for a little walk every day felt like the right thing. And then after about 3 weeks, the sirens came down and down bit by bit. When we were at the height of it for those 3 weeks, 700 or 700, 600, 700 deaths a day. On my little walk or throughout the day, I would look down the street and I would see an ambulance on our street. Or I would see the red and blue sirens from the police on the street over. And it was, every walk I went on, I saw an ambulance taking one of my neighbors away. And at this time, the reports were really that ambulance drivers were, being told not to resuscitate people, that people were coming in with lungs that looked like paper, or thin paper. And morgues were, beyond capacity. Refrigeration trucks were being brought in to deal with the corpses. So that's what we were reading every night. And then we would see it in our neighborhood and see our neighbors, none of whom I knew personally, but I would see, that person probably won't live. And then after that, fortunately, I have very few people close to me who died. And then after that, the deaths came down, the sirens went down, and we had some lovely weeks of, 6, 7, 8 weeks where we were just in a routine, waiting for what's next, but knowing that, we were just going to be in this perpetual unknown state for a long, long time to come, and just counting our blessings that both my husband and I had jobs, and jobs that were flexible despite my anxiety. And then the protests started, and the helicopters returned. And then there were helicopters everywhere monitoring the protests. And I didn't quite realize how impacted I had been by the sirens and the stress of the emergency workers and coronavirus until the helicopters were in the air, and it reignited that fear and that anxiety. And after about 7-8 days of helicopters literally right above head, right, 500 feet above us, we elected to take a little vacation to go see our in-laws in Virginia. And it seems like the city is changing and the protests have subsided. And so we're now it's now June 8th. And we are in we've started the 13th week of quarantine. And I hope that, that this is not a recurring event, and that in the next 6 months there is a vaccine, and hopefully we aren't in an era of plagues.
Why is the story you shared important to you?
I think this story is important to me just because the anxiety and the sweating and the need for Xanax is certainly just something it was a facet of myself that I didn't know. And I think the sirens is something that hasn't been heavily reported. The constant sirens in New York is not something that's been heavily reported. People on Twitter have written about it. Other people have certainly shared that experience. But it hasn't been widely documented how much those ongoing sirens were a shared experience amongst all New Yorkers. And so too have the helicopters about for the protests, and how those two are related, even though they're completely different reasons, right? One is for protests for Black Lives Matters and helicopters, and the other one's the sirens because people are dying. The fact that those two sounds are the only sounds you could hear or can hear, and they trigger the same sentiment in a person who is sheltered from both of these events. I am white and privileged and have not been participating in the protests, though I support them. And in the same way, COVID, there was no reason for me to think that I had COVID. I would get it. I was perfectly safe, and I had my job, and I didn't have financial insecurity. So while neither of those two events impact me, the perpetual sound and pain for other people that I don't even know, but the pain for the city and my neighbors who I don't know, and my cohort of African American youth who have been ongoingly neglected, the pain for the people that I don't know, and how that's triggered by the sound, and the sound that you cannot escape, such as sirens and helicopters above head, has been a very shared experience among New Yorkers. And I wanted to share that.